They came in the night. The clatter of boots on stone, a sudden slam of a door, a child's breath, too loud in a small room. For 60 minutes, a queen, once cloaked in silk and courtly ceremony, became a single, furious mother, a human barricade between her 8-year-old and the men who had come to take him. That hour, in the small hours of July 3, 1793, is the hinge of a story the textbooks often skim over. It reveals the cold, methodical cruelty that preceded the public spectacle of the guillotine, and the terrifying secrets the revolutionaries used to destroy a life before the blade ever fell. I'm going to take you inside those 76 days before the execution of Marie Antoinette. We'll move from the echoing tiles of the Temple prison to the windowless cells of the Conciergerie, from the tiny figure of Louis Charles to the courtroom where the state's theater of justice would be staged. At each turn, we'll follow contemporary testimony, memoirs, trial records, and the notes of eyewitness journalists, and the interpretations of historians who have reconstructed what the revolutionaries did not merely to punish, but to erase. If this story sounds like the kind of deep dive you want, subscribe and drop a comment. Let me know whether you think history remembers her fairly. But first, the scene. By the summer of 1793, the life that had once been Marie Antoinette's was reduced to a handful of rooms, a finite number of possessions, and 2 children who were, for the revolutionaries, instruments. She had already lost a son in infancy and a husband in January, executed in the Place de la Révolution. What remained, her daughter Marie-Thérèse and her son Louis-Charles, became the last, most vulnerable parts of her identity. Contemporary observers and later historians note that the revolutionaries recognized this vulnerability and treated it as a lever to be pulled. To understand how they wielded it, we first have to correct the caricature. The image that survives in popular lore, an extravagant foreigner, indifferent to French suffering, mouthing the apocryphal "let them eat cake," is a simplification born of political propaganda and hostile memoirs. Marie Antoinette was indeed an Austrian archduchess, placed into a marriage meant to secure a dynastic alliance. And she did live through a life marked by privilege and ceremony. But she was also a woman hardened by grief, a daughter who lost her family, a mother who had already buried a child, and a queen who watched a husband condemned under the new law of a republic that had turned its instruments against its makers. The Temple prison, where the royal family was confined after the fall of the monarchy, was not intended to be merely punitive. As historians such as Antonia Fraser and Simon Schama observe, it functioned as a place of controlled exposure, an institution of surveillance that turned intimacy into evidence. Guards filed in and out. Visitors were logged and interrogated. Private moments were monitored. Even the act of dressing, of exchanging a word with a child, was subject to the ever-present gaze of an administration that saw personal attachments as potential counter-revolutionary plots. Accounts from the period record the toll this took. Marie-Thérèse, the surviving daughter, left memoirs that describe the thinning of domestic privacy, the constant presence of men who were not family, the shortage of simple comforts, the small degradations that accumulate until a person is worn away. Official records from the Committee of Public Safety and the Commune of Paris, and later historians, agree. Imprisonment in the Temple was designed to be both containment and conditioning. The revolutionaries wanted to remove the monarch from the social sphere and, in the process, to convert family ties into civic liabilities. Then came the night of July 3rd. According to contemporary testimony recorded in the memoirs of Marie-Thérèse and the notes of several attendants, men arrived with orders to remove Louis Charles from his mother's charge. The stated purpose was to place him under Republican supervision and to sever the remnant of royal influence. What followed is described repeatedly in those primary accounts. Marie Antoinette refused. She stood between the guards and her son. She clung to him. She screamed to the point of collapse. Eyewitnesses describe an ordeal that lasted about an hour, brawling, pleading, and an eventual wrenching separation that left the queen broken in public view. Why would the revolutionaries take such a step, knowing the effect it would have? Historians interpret it as strategic cruelty. The child's custody was not only a bureaucratic decision, it was a means of emotional leverage. In the months that followed, the boy's isolation was used to gather evidence, testimony, and behavior that could be interpreted, recorded, and submitted at a later political moment. The act of removing him was less about his safety and more about creating a new narrative the state could present. The royal family, rearranged, diminished, and discredited. The man assigned to Louis Charles's care has become a figure at the heart of controversy. Antoine Simon, a cobbler by trade, later described in revolutionary paperwork as tasked with re-educating the boy. Contemporary accounts and later secondary scholarship indicate that Simon's role was to infuse republican habits, to strip away monarchical manners, and to assert control through methods that ranged from corporal discipline to psychological pressure. Primary sources vary on the details. The memoirs of those close to the royal family report episodes of harshness and abrupt humiliation, while later historians debate the extent and nature of the abuse. For our purposes, the documented point is the same. The boy's daily life was altered intentionally, and that alteration served the state's political ends.
Crucially, the revolutionaries sought not merely to reconfigure the child's behavior, but to weaponize his testimony. When Louis Charles later appeared before revolutionary authorities and gave statements that implicated the Queen in acts described in the public trial as moral crimes, those declarations had been obtained in an environment of coercion and adult supervision. Trial transcripts and investigative reports compiled by the Revolutionary Tribunal show that the prosecution, led by Antoine Fouquier-Tinville, relied on such statements to construct a narrative of depravity around Marie Antoinette. Historians, comparing the trial record to the conditions under which the child was held, have argued that the statements were produced under pressure and cannot be treated as conventional, free testimony. While the boy was being fashioned into a political witness, Marie Antoinette herself was moved to the Conciergerie. The transfer, completed in late August of 1793, according to prison logs and the chronologies assembled by several scholars, was a deliberate escalation. The Conciergerie was not the Temple's neighbor. It was a judicial prison, cold and public, where defendants awaited the machinery of revolutionary justice. She was registered as prisoner number 280. That number is itself telling. It transformed a historically central person into a statistic inside a ledger, a bureaucratic erasure that the revolutionaries intended as both practical and symbolic. Descriptions of her life there come from multiple sources: guards' reports, the few surviving letters, the memoirs of her daughter, and the notes of journalists who saw the procession. The cell arranged for her was small, windowed only to a narrow slit that delivered little light and less air. The Conciergerie's routines were humiliation by ritual. A folding screen, a privacy device in ordinary circumstances, became, according to witnesses, a stage prop. Guards positioned and removed it as if to make the performance of surveillance visible. Her correspondence was monitored, messages were intercepted. Visitors were limited. The social fabric she once relied upon was intentionally unraveled. Physically, the records show decline. Witnesses described her as pale, thin, and exhausted. She suffered from conditions associated with long confinement: tremors, intermittent fever, and a slow, insidious wasting that the attending physicians and guards recorded. Some of these observations can be found in medical notes preserved in archival files. Others appear in the more subjective testimonies collected after her death. Taken together, they paint a portrait of someone systematically deprived, not merely prosecuted. The trial itself, when it arrived, had the texture of theater more than of jurisprudence. The Revolutionary Tribunal, under the procedural hand of Fouquier-Tinville, operated with instruments that the state had honed to produce verdicts rapidly. Courtrooms were crowded with officials, journalists, and curious citizens. The prosecution enumerated a winding list of charges: correspondence with enemies of the Republic, misuse of national funds, and a catalog of accusations meant to frame her as both political traitor and moral corrupter. Among the most sensational reports presented at that tribunal was the testimony, such as it was, attributed to Louis Charles. This testimony included an allegation of incest, a claim that contemporary newspapers printed with relish and which the prosecution used as moral justification for its punitive fervor. We must be precise here, because precision matters. The incest accusation is part of the trial record, but historians and later legal scholars have repeatedly emphasized the conditions under which that accusation was produced. The child's testimony took place in an atmosphere of adult supervision and manipulation. Some reports indicate that statements were elicited under suggestion or influence. Marie-Thérèse's later memoirs and the observations of trusted attendants deny the likelihood of such acts and attribute the accusations to political theater. Major historians who have revisited the trial, examining both the original procès-verbaux and the social context, conclude that the charge cannot be verified, and that it was likely coerced, exaggerated, or entirely fabricated for public consumption. In short, present in the record? Yes. Proven? No. What the courtroom offered, in place of genuine evidence, was spectacle. The prosecutors understood how to convert rumor into legal currency. They assembled witnesses, some sincere, some compromised, arranged the events to maximize public shock, and then pronounced a verdict that many contemporaries perceived as preordained. When Marie Antoinette rose to speak, she did not offer confessions. She spoke instead with a voice historians describe as measured and dignified, addressing accusations and, importantly, reaching toward the mothers among those present. According to trial transcripts and later recollections, she appealed to common humanity and maternal duty, an appeal that resonated with some and infuriated others. But the tribunal had its script. The sentence, guilty and death, was pronounced with the procedural swiftness revolutionary tribunals had perfected. In the days that followed, Marie Antoinette attempted to arrange for what small comforts she could. She wrote letters. One, addressed to her sister-in-law Madame Elizabeth, was a final, intimate testament. In it, she laid out instructions for the children, expressions of love, and the human details that starkly contradicted the caricature painted in the press. The text of that letter survives in part in the archives and is cited by historians. It shows a woman attempting to preserve memory in the face of state erasure. According to correspondence preserved by relatives and noted in the work of Marie-Thérèse and later biographers, the letter was intercepted. Revolutionary officials confiscated messages sent from the Conciergerie and used that interception as another act of narrative control. A private voice rendered public property, then silenced. On the morning of October 16, 1793, the procession began. The cart that would carry her to the Place de la Révolution, a municipal vehicle repurposed for a civic ritual, rolled through streets lined with spectators. Contemporary journals and eyewitness notes describe the crowd, some jeering, others silent, some visibly moved. The state used the public movement as pedagogy. The journey to the scaffold was intended to convert criminal punishment into a civic lesson. The objects of scorn were paraded so the populace could see, judge, and be instructed. There is one moment before the blade that has lodged itself in many historical narratives because it reveals something essential about the woman they intended to dehumanize. As she stepped from the cart onto the scaffold, she accidentally crushed the foot of the executioner. Witnesses recorded that she turned, apologized, "Pardon me, sir, I did not mean to hurt you," and then turned again to face what came next. Some contemporaries found this act baffling, a queen, at the scaffold, apologizing for a small social wrong. Others saw it as the final register of a life devoted to ceremony and personal consideration. Whatever we make of it, the moment stands as a contradiction to the image the revolutionary press painted. Not a monstrous queen without feeling, but a person who, even confronted with death, made room for civility. Then the blade fell. Executioners and assistants, who kept meticulous logs, recorded the time. Witnesses in the square wrote that the crowd reacted in waves. Some sobbed, some cheered. For the state's propagandists, the execution closed a chapter. For those who knew the woman behind the headlines, the family, those who had shared the small domestic rituals, the loss was absolute and private. The 76 days that preceded her death did what the revolutionaries intended in one respect. They stripped away the trappings of monarchy, turned intimacy into evidence, and performed the public erasure of a figure the Republic wanted to consign to mythic ignominy. But in another respect, they failed. The methodical nature of the dehumanization, surveillance, separation, orchestrated humiliation, accidentally preserved the humanity it sought to erase. The records that document the cruelty preserve, as well, the narrative of a woman who loved, grieved, and tried to protect those she loved. Marie Therese's memoirs, the intercepted letters whose fragments survived in family papers, the medical notes, and the tribunal's own records, these strands, when woven together, create a portrait at odds with the caricature. This is not to excuse the monarchy, or to minimize the revolutionary context. The Ancien regime was a system of privilege and exclusion that generated real grievances.
The revolutionaries' aims were complex and in many minds morally defensible. What must be criticized, however, is the procedural cruelty that turned political necessity into a form of theatrical degradation. The machinery of surveillance, custody, and public trial did not merely punish. It transformed human relationships into instruments of state policy. The result was personal ruin manufactured through bureaucratic means. Consider for a moment the ways in which the state weaponized the ordinary elements of family life. A child's testimony, produced in an environment of coercion, became legal proof. A private letter, intended as a final testament between siblings, was seized and categorized. A folding screen, meant for privacy, was turned into a visible instrument of control. These are not accidental details. They demonstrate a systematic approach to erasure. Make private life public, make the intimate evidentiary, dissolve the self into registries and numbers. Marie Antoinette's registration as prisoner 280 is the emblem of that bureaucratic indifference. And yet, even when this apparatus did its worst, human reactions complicated the simplification. In the courtroom, the Queen's appeal to the mothers present, recounted in the procès-verbaux and in recollections of the tribunal, was a moment that forced some listeners to see, however briefly, the person behind the political symbol. Her intercepted letters, when quoted later by sympathetic memoirists, showed gestures of affection that refused to be wholly erased. The small apology on the scaffold, recorded by multiple witnesses, has been read by historians as a final affirmation of personal manners that outlived political portraiture. We must also keep careful sight of the sources and their limitations. Much of what we know comes from people who had stakes in the story. Marie Thérèse wrote with the memory of a daughter whose survival depended on shaping a narrative. Revolutionary journalists wrote to stoke public sentiment. Trial records were created in a legal culture that prized speed over procedural fairness. Modern historians have tried to triangulate these perspectives. Antonia Fraser, Simon Schama, and others have parsed the archival evidence with a view to separating propaganda from record, testimony from coercion. Their consensus is not a tidy one, but it supports a sober conclusion. The most sensational allegations against Marie Antoinette, particularly those involving her child, lack reliable, independent corroboration, and must be seen in the light of coercion and political expediency. So, what are the terrifying secrets then? They are procedural and psychological more than lurid. The revolutionaries perfected a set of techniques that could destroy a person's public identity without a single sensational proof. Removal of privacy, forced custodial separation, the use of children as political instruments, trial as theater, interception of private correspondence, and the ritualized procession that turned death into civic catechism. Those methods mattered because they allowed the state to rewrite a life in public terms. In Marie Antoinette's case, the rewriting was merciless and its methods were purposeful. But terror in this story also came from a paradox. The revolutionary apparatus intended to demonstrate the Republic's moral clarity by punishing a former queen. Yet the very tools it used revealed an anxiety about legitimacy. A state that must manufacture confessions and public spectacles is often a state that fears the force of persuasion. It needs the theater because the public, when confronted with complexity, might hesitate. So the terror is as much about what the state had to do to secure consent as it is about the individual acts of violence committed against one woman. When historians look back, they see the consequences. The image of Marie Antoinette hardened into a symbol used by both sides, by royalists to evoke martyrdom, and by Republicans to validate searing reprisal. The truth, preserved in fragments and argued over in archives, is messier. She was neither solely villain nor solely victim. She was a mother whose children were used against her, a queen whose political position became an ethical test for a revolutionary state, a human being who tried to preserve dignity inside instruments meant to strip it away. There is a final detail that deserves emphasis because it underlines the human cost. The boy, Louis Charles, the child whose custody began that fateful July night, died in prison at an age observers say was about 10. The circumstances of his death have been debated for centuries. Official reports cite illness, while some later rumors suggest other causes. What is not debated is the fact that the child spent the final years of his life under surveillance and adult control, molded into a witness and, ultimately, into a historical footnote. The revolutionaries had set out to break a dynasty. In doing so, they broke a child. History's verdict is not monolithic. Some see revolutionary necessity. Others see calculated cruelty. Most modern scholars, however, converge on an interpretation close to what the documents suggest. The system that judged Marie Antoinette was driven more by the politics of spectacle and the desire for narrative closure than by a sober weighing of evidence. That conclusion does not absolve the monarchy of past abuses, but it forces us to consider a harder question. What happens when state power uses the apparatus of law and administration to erase the human details that complicate political stories? If you walk away from this with one image, let it be this. In a small, dim cell, a woman wrote a letter that she hoped would carry her love forward. Outside, a regime arranged for her to be visible enough to judge. Inside the ledger, she was number 280. In the tender lines of her letters, she remained a mother. The terror of her last days was not a single monstrous act, but a steady bureaucratic unraveling, strategic, patient, and thorough, which sought to convert a human life into a public lesson. So was Marie Antoinette, a villain, a victim, or something more complicated. The archival record and careful scholarship push us away from simple answers. She was a figure made by history's pressures, political, social, and private. The revolutionaries' techniques were terrifying because they revealed a willingness to subordinate human dignity to the needs of a political narrative. That is a lesson beyond the specifics of 1793. When a state treats intimacy as evidence and procedure as spectacle, it erodes the boundary between justice and performance. If this account shifted the way you think about her, if it made you see the person beneath the pamphlets and the slogans, leave a comment below. Tell us whether you see a woman undone by history or an agent of a system that deserved critique. Subscribe for more deep investigations into the messy, human stories behind history's headlines. In the end, the guillotine was only the final instrument. The terrifying secrets are found in the days before it. In the rooms where privacy was traded for paperwork, in the custody decisions that turned a child into a tool, in letters that were never allowed to reach their destination, and in a judicial process that preferred spectacle to scrutiny. Those 76 days are a cautionary tale about the power of institutions to invent facts, and the fragile endurance of the human voice, even when officials try to silence it. History keeps the records. It keeps the numbers, the dates, and the trial minutes. It also keeps the scraps of a letter, the memory of an apology, and the testimony of a daughter who refused to let the story be wholly simplified. Those fragments are the remnants of a life that the revolutionaries meant to erase, and they are the reason we must keep looking, carefully and faithfully, at what happened before the blade.